지금부터 UN 정보안보 개방용 워킹그룹의
Now, we will begin the session under the title of the Outcome and Process of the Open-Ended Working Group on Development in the Field of Information Telecommunication in the Context of International Community. I am the MC for this session. I would like to introduce you, the moderator of this session, the Mr. Park No-hyun, graduated from the Korean University in the field of law and also studied at the Harvard University. He is now working as a professor of law at Korean University. And he is also serving as a member of the Dutch, serving as a center for this cyber information, and also he is also serving as an advisor to the Korean government in this field. So I would like to deliver the microphone to our moderator. Please give me a big round of applause. Thank you very much. This session, the title is on the open-ended working group, and it's the outcome and prospect. And this session was hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and National Security Division and Korea, the Cyber Law Center. And this open-ended working group and the UNGGE, these two national entities had adopted the final report, and today even if our title is on the OEWG, and we could not, Korea only joined the OEWG session, but the contents that we are going to deal with is in line with OEWG and also GGE, and what kind of implications that it has on the international law of the cyberspace and the voluntary law, and also the CVN. So these are the scope of the conversation. So may I continue? Today's session, before we begin, I would like to give you some the information beforehand. And I would like to tell you why the dialogue regarding OEWG and GGE are so much important. In the 1980s, Russia, in the General Assembly, well, at that time, it was they were considering the information law, and then Russia at that time proposed that the cyber related law is needed, and then after time goes by, the UN, the cyber space related the body was formed, and use of ICT by states was somehow adopted. Well, in Korea, we see that, we understand that as a cyber the security, and within the UN context, they say that it is also in line with the international law. Then, well, if it is related, aligned, then how can we dived into its applicability in the international law, and nowadays. We much talk about voluntary norms, and from the year 2004 and until the year 2015, we have seen a greater progress, and very unfortunately, on the fifth the session, we were not able to have this failed to adopt the final report. and it would come out during our session, and international the humanitarian law the wording itself should be mentioned on the final report or not. That was a hot issue during then of the draft of the GGE of the fifth session, and so and then we as you all know, it was failed to be adopted, and then this year we are successfully. And then after that was a Russia-led OEWG was one of them. And then from the Russian point of view, it has its own justifications. And then the 20 or the 30 was 20 plus the member state UN the states were from the Russian point of view, it is somewhat too close, and so little number of the states are joining the session, so that the Russia the proposed that the more universal, which is more extensive to all of the U.S. state members were needed, and so that's why the OEWG was formed. But on its contrary, that UN, United States, and its like-minded nations, their idea was that so far the mentioned all those agendas and the need to go on, so so that we are now in the situation that where the two entities, the global international entities, are dealing with the similar the issues called the cyber security. And this year, we have seen that the final report was adopted. And in this session, we would like to touch upon the voluntary norms and CBNs, and also that its scope. So we would like to talk in this regard. And we have the panelists joining this session, and for their profiles can be traced in our website, and then in this session, each panel will elaborate on their stance or their ideas regarding the topics that we have today, and if we have, and after going each of each of our speakers, we would spare some time, if possible, to receive the Q&A, to go on the Q&A session. And then we will give our panelists about 1 minute to close up the session to save the time. We have from the Netherlands, we have Mr. Dennis Bradis. Is he here with us now? Dr. Dennis? So I would like to give him the 10 minutes to speak. So are you ready?
Good afternoon, everyone. I have a bit of an echo. Well, I'll speak through it. Good afternoon, everyone. I was asked to sort of give a bit of a bird's eye view over the two processes that we have seen, sort of the open-ended working group and the UNGGE. And just start off sort of with what have we gained in these two processes that ended in consensus reports in 2021. So I would say the open-ended working group, what we gained is a reaffirmation of what is now called the GGE acquis. So the framework that results from the GGE reports in 2010, 2013, and 2015. And we gained that in a process that was open to all UN member states. If we look at the UNGGE reports, I think we made some progress on international law. We made some progress on norms. We have this added layer of understanding to the 11 norms from the 2015 GGE report. And if you take them both together, and the chair already alluded to that, it is the first two double consensus reports on cybersecurity within the UN system since 2015. That's significant in itself. If you take an internal view, so if you look at the processes from the perspective of the participating states, and you look at the process, there's a number of things I would like to flag. So at the outset of these two processes, given how they came about, the chances of not having a report were actually quite high, I would say. But also at the same time, these two processes were locked in what I call sort of a dynamic of mutually assured diplomacy. So there was a very high chance that they would either both fail or they would both succeed. Other outcomes were possible, but it was actually quite likely that this would be happening. So either fail or succeed, but together. So let's mention the COVID word. So COVID happened sort of midway with these processes, which means that the whole process had to move online. The open-ended working group was, of course, a very open process. It was something that could be followed, so the world was watching. But in the move online, it was interesting to see that the informal consultations were not public. And the interesting thing is that the informal publications were, let's say, perhaps a little bit less diplomatic than the ones that were out in the sunshine, but perhaps that served the function as well. Another procedural thing that I think is very important is the interaction with other processes. So states often play chess on different boards at the same time, but now also within the realm of sort of UN cybersecurity, there was an open-ended working group, there was a GGE, then in the third committee, there was talk about cybercrime. Before the process closed, there was a new UN open-ended working group for 2021 to 2025. That was already starting, and we're talking about a POA. So a lot of things happening in the same sphere. One of the main things for the open-ended working group was inclusion. So it was open to all member states. Many delegations participated, perhaps more than imagined, but it was also selection, right? So a limited number of member states participated very actively, and then an even more limited number was able to sort of frame the debate in the way it goes. Last thing on process is the chairs. So we had great chairs for both processes, I think. Other than getting a consensus report for their specific group, they had also very different challenges. So Jörg Lauber, of whom I'm a fan now, had a huge and a very effective trick in sort of moving from different draft to different draft. So in one of the drafts, he sort of took everything that started with a sentence like some states think or some states agree on. So everything that was not consensus, he moved it into the discussion part of the report. Then at some point, he moved them all together to the end of the report and put them in italics, which I think is diplomatic for this is on its way out. And then in the last version, it was out. So he kept only the consensus language. He moved all the discussion pieces into a chair summary. And then he played hardball with the member states and said, okay, take it or leave it. This is it. I think that was usually effective. If we hadn't done that, we probably wouldn't have had a report. That also upped the challenge for Patriota, who was chairing the GGE, because not only did he have to deliver a report, he had to deliver a report that was meaningfully more than the open-ended working group report that was already published. So that sort of created a dynamic too. In terms of content, so if you look at the open-ended working group, so I think the most important thing is the reaffirmation of the GGE acquis. So we reaffirm that these things that we've done in 2010, 13, and 15, that these are important. It also locks the mantra of international law applies in cyberspace as it does offline. It locks it into a UN GGE consensus, UN consensus, and there is some minor progress on norms. If you look at the GGE, there's some progress on international law. So there's an explicit mention of international humanitarian law. There's explicit mention of the peaceful settlement of disputes, but I'm in a panel with lots of lawyers, so I'm going to leave that to the lawyers to debate the ins and outs. But there's also a slight pushback against international law in both reports. So on the insistence of China, the order between norms and law got reversed. It used to be international law, then norms, now it's norms, and now and after that, international law. Also the annex, which was part of the mandate for the GGE, has been taken out. There's going to be a separate document. It's going to be an official companion, but it's not allowed to be called an annex anymore. On threats and norms, there is also some minor. There is guidance on what the 2015 norms are. So what do they mean? What do they require, etc. And norms between brackets, basically, because they're not essentially new norms. But there's a special attention for cyber attacks on healthcare, election infrastructure. There's attention for the protection of the public core of the internet, which is not phrased as such, but the technical infrastructure essential to the general availability or integrity of the internet. So there is some progress. If we take the external view, if we look from the outside in, then perhaps it looks a little bit harder. So progress has been made, but is it enough? So if we take 2015 as a cutoff point, when the last report came out, lots of things have happened and lots of things have been worrying states and citizens alike, basically. We've seen election interference, we've seen information operations, we've seen crippling cyber attacks like NotPetya and WannaCry, we've seen ransomware surging, we've seen espionage, we've seen supply chain attacks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of things have we seen, and the question is, are they addressed? We have also seen an increase in public attribution by some countries. That's not a broad thing, but public attributions. However, these public attributions do not make much reference to international law or to the framework of responsible state behavior, which is interesting in itself. So if you look at these below the threshold problems that we seem to be worrying about, from that perspective, the reports are perhaps less rich than they perhaps could have been. So the mantra that international law in cyber applies, and that the question is, how does it apply, needs a lot more answers than are given in the report. And so we've known this question for a while. We've been grappling with this question for a while, but we need answers. And the fact that the annex has been downgraded is not per se good news, I would say. There is a huge gap between different countries on the practice and the legitimacy of public attribution. This was a major sticking point in both processes, and there's really not a lot of room to move forward there, I would say. The added layer of understanding for the 2015 norms, so so they said no new norms, we're just going to add a layer of understanding under the 11 2015 norms. That has its advantages, but it also works as a straitjacket. You either squeeze something in under a norm, or you cannot address it. And then sometimes that works, right? For example, the public core, so the general availability of the internet, you can put that under the 2015 norms that talk about international, that talk about critical infrastructure protection. That sort of works. If you look at election interference, the only place to put it is under, again, under the infrastructure norm. So it becomes election infrastructure, not election interference, but election interference with election infrastructure, technical infrastructure. Works a little bit less well already. If you look at information operations more general, flagged in the threat section as something states worry about, you can't put it anywhere. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'll leave open to debate, but you can't put it in this straitjacket. Last point, the language of the added layer of understanding goes hand in hand with the language of implementation of norms. So a lot of states have been talking until they're blue in the face that we need to talk about the implementation of these norms. That has the risk of trying to make a bureaucratic exercise of something that is really very political. And that's difficult. So especially if you look at negative norms. So negative norm says you can't interfere with another country's CERT, you can't interfere with another country's critical infrastructure. You cannot implement a negative norm. A negative norm is a norm of self-restraint. It's something that states have to do themselves. There's no implementation plan for that. And so you can't implement your way out of it. Last line, and then I'll hand it back to the chair. New open-ended working group has already started. So the week after we finished the report of the GGE, already there was the first session of the open-ended working group. So the train moves on. Many of these problems have landed into the chair summary of the previous open-ended working group and will resurface. So we're just going back and going forward with this. Open-ended working group is open to new norms. And we have a POA, so a program of action that is being debated. We don't really know what shape or form that will get exactly, but that's also in the making. With that, I'll stop and I'll hand it back to the chair. Thank you very much.
고맙습니다. 두 번째.
Before we invite the second expert,
I'd like to ask one question to Mr. Janice Brothers. In the open-ended working group,
members were very active라고 하셨는데 혹시 그 오픈엔디드 워킹 그룹 안에서 그 GG
in open-ended group, the 25 members of GGE, what would be the roles of those 25 countries of the GGE? Can you explain their roles in GGE?
The roles, the different countries that were participating in the UNGGE?
No, I mean, I guess in the open-ended working group, those members participating in the GGE, they also attended the open-ended working group. In that case, if it is true, then was there any conspicuous or significant role of them in the open-ended working group discussion?
I think what is, so if you go back to sort of the nativity scene of these processes, then sort of the open-ended working group was a Russia-led process, whereas the GGE, the new GGE, was an American-led process. And you can see it in the way that countries voted on it. It was sort of a block vote with yes for the one and no for the other, the way around. But I think once everybody was on the page that, okay, this is going to happen, and they're actually joined at the hip. So if one of these groups tried to mess up the other one's process, then nothing would happen, and we would get nothing out of both processes. So I think, and sort of the open-ended working group began a little bit before the GGE. So the goodwill to be created was to be created in the open-ended working group. And I think a lot of countries did that. I think they were quite constructive, trying to move it along. And gradually, especially sort of the like-minded states, as they are called, gradually started to realize that there was actually something to be gained in the open-ended working group, and that was to, on the stage of the world itself, to make sure that we get the whole UN General Assembly to agree to what has been achieved in the process of the GGEs before that moment, which was, after all, an expert process of a limited number of states. So I think there was a lot to be gained in terms of the legitimacy of what had been achieved before. And a number of countries have really been sort of going the extra mile in making sure that both processes were handled in a good way, making sure also to some extent that some of the countries who are not part of the GGE, but sort of taking on board things that were said in the open-ended working group and also taking them on board in the UNGGE. So in the end, this was more collaborative than I initially expected. I hope that answers your question, Chair.
Okay, thank you. 고맙습니다.
thank you very much. According to the sequence of this session, I need to invite you to Mr. Anna Kentik from Hansung University. However, we have some connection problem here. So I'd like to invite you, David Michael Majlisi, the ICRC mission on Seoul, head of mission. I'd like to invite.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea and the Cyber Law Center of Korea University for inviting the ICRC to participate in this session. And I would like to comment that I am fully surrounded by professors and global experts and feeling just a slightest bit intimidated. So I would like to take a kind of practitioner's view to our comments to bring the ICRC's experience and to address the topic at hand, and with special thanks, of course, to Dr. No-Young Park and to those joining us abroad, and thank you to the translators for their work. To begin, I would say that the ICRC, as a neutral and humanitarian organization with a mandate based in the Geneva Conventions, has been actively engaging with both of the UN processes, actively engaged and focused its engagement on its mandated tasks as guardian of the international humanitarian law, and with a focus, of course, on armed conflict and protecting the victims of armed conflict. While the GGE was open only to states, the ICRC was able to participate in all sessions of the working group. More generally, the ICRC was active in both processes by submitting a position paper entitled IHL and Cyber Operations During Armed Conflict, by making numerous official statements before the working group, by having bilateral meetings and multilateral meetings with states, and by promoting main messages through various media, including its social media, its blogs, and published articles. The ICRC's main objectives in all of this engagement was to, and this is a quote, attain consensus among states that IHL governs, and thus restricts cyber operations during armed conflict. This engagement led to the two official reports, or was noted in the two official reports mentioned. And as mentioned, the GGE made particular explicit reference to IHL, while the working group addressed IHL in the chair's summary note. And note taken, Professor, that the explicit mention of IHL is an indicator of progress, but certainly not the end of the discussion. Just an additional word, just last week, Wednesday, the ICRC has also issued a report called Avoiding Civilian Harm from Military Operations During Armed Conflict. And this is the outcome of an expert meeting of the ICRC organized in 2020. It is available to the general public, it's online, and includes a range of positions, not just that of the ICRC. What emerged from this meeting, we would like to share with you now as is the conclusion that states need to invest more time and resources to develop the tools to process and assess the risks of incidental harm and during cyber operations, and to take measures to limit these risks. It also takes particular notice of the need to integrate these lessons and these processes into military decision-making processes. We draw a further lesson from our experience with the open-ended working group and from our experience of today's field realities. Today, the international community and societies, and each one of us individually, are increasingly dependent and reliant on digital tools. We cannot separate ourselves from them. This has increased dependency on the uninterrupted functioning of technology and increases our vulnerability to cyber operations of a hostile nature. Cyber operations during armed conflict, therefore, can cause significant harm to civilian populations, especially if affecting critical civilian infrastructure, such as medical facilities, electrical capacity, water, or sanitation. We must therefore develop a clear-eyed understanding of modern armed conflict as it is fought across multiple domains, all of which are facing digital transformation. War is fought traditionally on land, air, and sea, but now also in cyberspace and connected through satellite to space itself. The question is therefore not about hackers and black hats alone, but rather how does digital transformation influence the modern battle space, and how do armed forces prevent and minimize civilian harms in their otherwise lawful conduct of military operations. The ICRC took note during the open-ended working group and the GGE that the healthcare sector in particular faces vulnerabilities to cyber attack. And this became particularly apparent during our COVID pandemic experiences, when hospitals and other healthcare facilities in various states had their operations disrupted by hostile cyber operations. It is an important step forward, therefore, that all states recognized in the 2021 open-ended working group report the potentially devastating humanitarian consequences of malicious ICT activities on critical infrastructure supporting essential services. Because we're here with professors and experts, I think we'll take the opportunity to go into a more technical conversation about the law itself and ICRC's positioning. We should note that neither IHL nor other fields of international law contain comprehensive definitions of cyber operations, cyber warfare, or cyber war itself. The ICRC understands these terms, specifically cyber operations during armed conflict, to mean operations against computer systems or networks or other connected devices through a data stream when used as a means or method of warfare in the context of armed conflict. This raises the question, of course, of IHL, international humanitarian law's applicability. In the ICRC's view, there is no question that cyber operations during an armed conflict or cyber warfare are regulated by IHL, just as any other weapon, means of method of warfare used by a belligerent during armed conflict, new or old. There is increasing recognition among states, including the Republic of Korea, that international law does apply in cyberspace, and in particular, that international humanitarian law applies and therefore restricts cyber operations during conflict. For example, in 2016, the GGE report cited the core of IHL, the laws and the principles of humanity, necessity, distinction, and proportionality as applicable to the use of ICTs by states during armed conflict. Interestingly, the report made it clear that the application of this law to cyber operations during armed conflict by no means legitimizes or encourages conflict. The ICRC is also clear on this. Applying IHL to cyber operations does not encourage the militarization of cyberspace and should not in any way be understood as legitimizing cyber warfare. As with other forms of force between states, any resort to the force, whether digital or kinetic, remains governed by the UN Charter and customary international law, including the prohibition against the use of force in international relations. Moving to more specific legal debates, while it is generally accepted that IHL applies to cyber operations during armed conflicts, states still recognize the need for further study on how and when these laws apply. The ICRC agrees with states and acknowledges this need. We also want to point out, however, that the general and actual application of IHL to cyber operations is not complicated. We find these important theoretical issues remaining at the margins, and we like to focus on these issues now because we see the need to settle them. But most of the time, applying IHL to cyber operations is relatively straightforward and should not lead to significant difficulties. To illustrate the point, the threshold question of when IHL applies asks, can a standalone cyber operation itself trigger the application of the Geneva Conventions, or of IHL more generally? This is particularly interesting if the operation in question does not cause physical damage or lead to death or injury. The question is relevant mainly as regards interstate or international armed conflict, as we refer to it, as there is no intensity requirement for the applicability of IHL in international conflict. The ICRC and experts in general agree that cyber operations on their own have the potential to cross this threshold and trigger the applicability of IHL. However, the question of what actually does so remains unsettled. Once again, though, while legally exciting, it's worth noting that the essential question is settled. The fundamental point is widely accepted that cyber operations led alongside or in support of kinetic operations during armed conflicts are already governed by IHL. There are additional debates and questions around the definition of an attack or the nature of dual-use objects, which unfortunately time will not allow me to go into the same level of detail. I do want to highlight, however, the ICRC's view that operations that are designed, for instance, to disable a computer or a network during armed conflict can constitute an attack as defined by IHL. There are additional questions regarding sensitive civilian data that I would like to bring to people's attention, and whether civilian objects, whether civilian data is protected in the same way that civilian objects are already listed as being protected, specifically protected under IHL. Questions such as this are critical for operations that are not designed to cause physical harm, but cause great amount of suffering for the civilian population if left unchecked. The ICRC's view is that essential civilian data, including medical data, should enjoy the same protection as civilian objects. The relevancy of this is clear, as IHL sets out specific protections for these objects and services indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. However, in both cases, existing law does protect these vital sources of civilian survival. Lastly, once again, I'd like to say thank you from the ICRC, on behalf of the ICRC, for allowing us to speak again at the Jeju Forum, which has special meaning to us as the Republic of Korea was one of the first states ever to support the applicability of international humanitarian law to cyber operations, and specifically to the healthcare sector and protecting it against malicious cyber operations. I thank you very much and look forward to the discussion with the rest of the panel.
네, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much. Well, as you know, ICRC is like a pioneer of norms. And there are several issues to address. As you have mentioned, data is, especially the civilian data, is whether it is a civilian, the issue of the civilian data has been mentioned on the IHL, and France recently has issued a position paper and about the medical data, banking data, and the contents data are also part of the civilian data. That was the position of the France, and then so there are the increasing number of the countries that are following the IHL. We would like to move on to our next the panelist. Is the Mr. Yoo Jung-gun, is the professor of Yonsei University. Thank you. I am the Yoo Jung-gun. As our previous the panelists have mentioned, I would like to add some of my own opinions, and then also that to look on the implications of the final report of the OEWE, and also whether what are the directions of the cyber, the security-related dialogue should go for the future. So when we had the fifth the session, there were big the issues that has been raised. Then that was about the use of the internet. The use of the internet should be limited to just a few number of people, and then it is open to the general public all around the world. And then how should we accommodate the opinions of various countries? And the second was that the cyber threat are very interlinked with economy and politics issues. Then how can we also that reflect all those kind of issues as well, so that we had four major type of pillars of this the session. And then, well, the member states were somehow divided into two parts, whether we should inherit and go on with the GGE type, or that we should set up a totally new type of international bodies called OEWG, so that, well, so that we can accommodate more diverse opinions of many different countries. And then this OEWG and the sixth the session of GGE had somewhat different, they take different the directions. And one of the major implications that OEWG has is that when we look at the final report, it has the 14 paragraphs for introduction, and in the third GGE report, it has only several paragraphs, but has been lengthened. And we can indicate that the UN is willing to accommodate the cyber security related issues from now on, and that has been endorsed by the UN entity. And the cyber security is also part of the UN dialogue, and that it was somehow so OEWG is more the reflective of the spirit of this the cyber security and the accommodating of the many different ideas of many states. But one difference is that we have the previous mentions have talked about the critical infrastructure, but from the sixth the report, the infrastructure somehow was undermined. So we have the CI. We also have this the critical the information infrastructure. Then well, when we get into detail about the water main management or the medical the facilities, these kind of issues were also mentioned in the OEWG. And the second issue is that the cyberspace is very dynamic and it changes as time goes on. And the cyber threat, and in regard to cyber threat, that many different countries have different interests, and that they have many different the approach. So there are some states that would call for the supply chain, as like the countries in China, and then both also in other countries, while they talk about importance of the supply chain, but they have the totally different point of view on the same same topic. And there was another very highly disputed area was the data security, and how we should approach this issue. And we have about this in terms of the global security. Well, who will take this initiative, the global initiative, and also there are countries that each country they should take its own the sovereignty to take care of each country's data. Or there are also some other countries that say that the free flow of information is necessary, and that IHL is need to be much explicitly clarified, and it is in the UN process. It says that IHL it should be applicable, but within the cyberspace, applicability of the cyberspace, it says that it is less persuasive, and in that context, there were the recommendations or the ideas that we need to make it more explicit, and in regard to the international law, in the paragraph 5 of the second report, it talks about this implementation. So we have the sovereignty, national sovereignty, and the international humanitarian law, and the fundamental freedom. These are three issues has been recognized, and in the original consensus was much narrowed down, but in the sixth session, this has been mentioned that it would be it would constitute the core area, and then well, in regard to this data sovereignty, the kind of the conflicts where the conflicting dialogue would somehow go on. And OEWG, the highly debated area is that how should we continue our the dialogues under which type of the international entity? Should we follow the dual track or the single track? And to be and there are and then also we have this the issue of the support endorsement, and so that it's much better that we shift our ideas to it is likely that the states would focus on the implementation of these issues, and then OEWG, and then its counter the ideas, which is the POA, and whether we would accommodate this a dual track, or would go on following this single track. And in this regard, OEWG is renewing its final report in every 5 years. So whether it is in terms of the cyberspace, well, it is meaningful that OEWG has somehow given this momentum to consider this cybersecurity issues, and then it is important that we need to think about how we should apply or reflect this GGE's ideas or in this OEWG.
Thank you very much, Professor Liu. The support for OEWG and the future prospects regarding those, he provided a very detailed explanation. The program action is one of the key issues in the OEWG report and the GGE report. Both reports mention about the POA. As Professor Liu mentioned that, I also wonder the future of POA. So previously in the European countries suggested this POA. Okay, thank you for your comment. And then I'd like to invite Mr. Myung-hyun Chung, the professor from Korea University. Please provide your opinion within 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Based on the speeches of the other speakers, so now I can understand the outcomes of the progress of OEWG and the GGE now. And in this journey, so international laws, I think that most countries across the world, they have reached consensus on that they need to abide by the international laws. The problem over here is that how to implement the law, international laws. So in this stage, we should figure out some specific process in each country and the role of CBM. So I'd like to mention some specific cases. Mid of June, last June, Korea Nuclear Power Research Institute was attacked by North Korea. That was the National Cyber kind of the National Research Institute. However, the institute was hacked. Attacked by. It became the victim of cyber attack. We identified the IP address. Kimsky is a kind of North Korean hacker group, and we found that the group is also associated with the attack. And until the end of last year, Daewoo Shipbuilding and offshore company. The company also was hacked by the hackers. So our submarines, our systems were hacked. There was not a single attack. Back in 2016, we had a kind of attack and a massive amount of data was leaked. It was stolen by the hacker group. And the Solines accident, which was very notorious, and it was found that the Solines, the case was done by a Russian hacker group, and it was actually publicly announced by the US as well. And in that course, the UK the Russian hacker group. Actually, the UK made public about the very specific information of the Russian hacker group. Then, this is notorious. It's a malicious attack. It's a malicious cyber operation. It should not be allowed according to the international laws. That should be the conclusion among the countries. The Kimsky. Now we have more detailed information about their history. According to the record, they started their operation starting from 2010, and how we should respond to such kind of malicious operations of the group. Then sovereignty issue emerged. The cyber infrastructure, kind of physical damage. Of course, there was no physical damage. However, they penetrated to the system, and even if it is temporarily, they suspended the operation, and they disrupted the daily operation. That should not be allowed. That should not be. So yes, that's the currently most countries across the world. So they think that we should not tolerate such kind of action. Then how should we respond to those attacks? Even if we apply the international laws, the response of each country may vary because they will act according to their international laws and policies. So major countries such as US, UK, or EU, and other countries, regarding the malicious attacks attacking the certain countries, they publicly denounce those countries, although the groups, the activists, they may prosecute those groups, or they may freeze their funds to stop their operation, or they impose other sanctions to prevent, to block the entry to certain countries. So countries are now taking preemptive action. So these national practices are being shared in the OEWG meetings as well. And then we'll of course see further changes based on these cases. So malicious act in cyberspace, it is of course it's beyond the boundary. It's borderless problem. So to respond to the cyber attacks, cooperation or collaboration with other countries is required to identify who is the attacker. What is the root of the attack? We will need the support of second or third countries to identify the attacker. In that sense, by building CBM, we should transparently exchange the information of the attackers, and then we should build trust among the countries to raise the responsibilities of each country. For development and implementation of CBM, they are also emphasizing the role of the UN. Cyber Policy Portal of the UN is a place to share, of course, currently to share these practices of different countries. Some infringement cases are reported through this portal. I think this portal can be very useful. And as part of CBM, because of digital divide, there can be some cases, isolated cases, or some kind of victimized cases. To prevent customer isolation or some worsening cases, multi-stakeholders should be involved. To better protect the victims. So bilateral and multilateral CBM should be developed. That's the way to better respond to cyber attacks. And that's the way to support the implementation of international laws. Thank you very much.
우리 정 박사
Thank you very much. You have mentioned about how to deal with this malicious attack and ill-minded attack, and how important the credibility building is. And we need to invite one more person. Is he connected? Let's wait for a second.
Hello. 오케이. 이제
Okay, so let's have an expert in the field of the cyber policy, and she is in fact from the Estonia, and the place that Estonia is leading in terms of the cyber policy. And also, it is that she is also working very closely from the Finland. So we would like to give about 10 minutes to our Dr. Anakin Teak. Are you ready?
So, really happy to share my thoughts with you today on these two parallel developments in the open-ended working group and in the GGE. And I definitely echo some of the contributions made by previous speakers, especially on how much progress both processes have made on this framework of responsible state behavior, that is this international law, voluntary norms, and CBMs, and especially on the implementation of what we have come to call norms. And then I would like to highlight maybe some things that were more that in my analysis were especially important or maybe somewhat different. I believe that with this last year, the international dialogue on cybersecurity has fundamentally changed. And it has been this open-ended working group process that has changed it into a more inclusive, more transparent, and therefore more accountable. And in other words, what was previously possible in a small group to discuss things with some plausible deniability, it has become much more difficult. And I believe that also this last year has cemented the UN as a platform for discussing issues of international cybersecurity for the foreseeable future. And at the same time, it is clear that by opening this process up, it has come more about what cybersecurity is meant to achieve, and that is other things that are important in the UN agenda, in the global agenda: economic growth, sustainable development, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. And therefore, we are more aware that any consensus on cybersecurity issues cannot be the consensus of most advanced countries, but it is also the realities of these less connected and less digitally capable countries and interested countries that we need to take into account. And of course, the global pandemic has been a catalyst for acknowledging just how wide the issue really is, that it's not just the first committee issue or not just international peace and security issue, but the matter of international development and prosperity. So with that, I think these past two processes that just now concluded have also emphasized that much more needs to be achieved at national level. So there is a limit to how much can be agreed internationally, and that national legislation, strategies, processes, and entities all are part of how we do better cybersecurity. I would also say that although there has been more transparency and more inclusion, not just of all states, but also involving the private sector and civil society in these discussions, to me, it seems that there is hardly any promise of any equal level dialogue between governments and non-government actors. So it has been more this inclusion by way of being able to follow the process, but not necessarily like it's not yet an equal partnership, and therefore different views on how to do supply chain security or what there should be the standards of human rights remain between not just governments, but also between governments and non-state groups. I already said that I think this open-ended working group has now underscored the utility of the UNGGE and a more closed expert group, because some issues just are not manageable in an open process. And I would now echo this concern about international law, meaning I would say that overall there has been very little progress made on international law. And although it might not be very evident from the GGE reports itself, but then if you look at the resolution establishing now the new open-ended working group, that very clearly says that there is a desire for further developing not just international law, but also norms, rules, and principles of state behavior. And it's important to note that in the like-minded discussion is very clearly differentiated. The voluntary norms and international law is much less differentiated or significant the difference to Russia and China. So we need to be mindful of that. What we frame as voluntary and non-binding norms, we actually may be as well discussing what would constitute the basis for discussion of where international law is considered to fall short of some of the expectations. And I would also share the ICRC's concern on IHL, because I would say that despite different attempts, there is no affirmative conclusion of the applicability of IHL to cyber operations, because the conclusion that now has been made is that it applies to, yes, in conflict, but it doesn't still say how and to what extent countries agree that IHL is the primary framework for addressing cyber operations, which of course leads us back to this major issue of peacetime cyber operations, and alongside the inconclusivity of how IHL applies in cyberspace. What I think is really significant about the discussions on international law is this emphasis that both open-ended working group and the UNGGE have made on the obligation and principle of peaceful settlement of international disputes. Because I think we see clearly in cyberspace how cyber operations have become a new tool for countries that have unresolved issues from the past. So meaning they have had underlying disputes that they haven't resolved before cyber era, and now it's just the same dyads, the same competitors using cyber operations against each other. And that, of course, is a reminder that not all the world has the same issues in cyberspace. So this emphasis on peaceful settlement, I think, is a really useful reminder that we need to do a lot more to prevent cyber operations, not just to respond to them. And there is now a first call out to start thinking about that in more detail. To conclude, I think we are right now in a situation where, on the one hand, the fact that both open-ended working group and the UNGGE resulted in consensus reports, to me, speaks of a somewhat satisfactory equilibrium between the major powers. So meaning that everybody has either gained something or not given anything major away. But at the same time, we all are winners as civil society, as other countries, as even the private sector, of that the conversation is continuing. So we are not locked into let's say adversarial or like this situation where there wouldn't be any dialogue or any progress. So there are many wins. So on the one hand, civil society and the private sector have gained better access to the dialogue. the US got their GGE, Russia got their open-ended working group. The like-minded have now incepted the program of action idea successfully. And I think cyber diplomacy has won. So we have come back from this difficult situation a few years back. But if I were to conclude with one caution, one word of caution, then to me, these reports still read a little bit like guidance to everybody else rather than the actual restraint to those most invested in cyber conflict. So that I don't think is resolved. It's simply contained. Thank you.
고맙습니다. 제가 하나만 에네킨틱 박사께 간단.
I would like to ask one thing to Dr. Tick. In terms of the endorsement, we're giving support, OEWG, Open and Working Group. So from this year until from the 5 years from now, the second OEWG. So we had this organization meeting on the 1st of June. And in regard to the mandate, thematic subgroup can be formed. But in the previous meeting, there were no consensus made on this the sub-working group meeting. So, but you are joining the second session of the OEWG. So what do you think about this subgroup? Can it be, is it realistic, or it can be another the non-binding voluntary the form of groups? So any ideas that you have in this regard?
It doesn't pay well to be a fortune teller, but I would say that all these processes have shown to me that the more we talk about the issues that are of concern to different groups, especially to different countries, the more countries get prepared to further their agenda, and that now means that like whatever subgroups are created, it doesn't only depend on how carefully these questions are framed or moderated, but it also depends on whether countries are able to take lead and other actors are able to take lead in these grounds that are ruled by other governments. So it becomes this ability to navigate within the agenda, to build your own agenda, to see through different ambitions in the room. And I would also say that this is a potential also for the private sector. I think this having access to the process prepares us to, as civil society and as private sector, to achieve in these processes, although it may take time to start playing the game.
고맙습니다. Thank you. 그러면 이제 5분의
Okay, thank you very much.
전문가들의 발제를 들었습니다.
So we have speeches from 5 speakers. We have about 12 minutes left. So last 5 minutes, I'm going to provide it. Okay, if you have a question, okay, I'm going to take some questions. If you have from the floor, maybe 2 questions. I'm going to get the 2 questions from the floor if possible. Please identify yourself. Hello. I'm Park Joo-hee from the Korea University Cyber Law Center. Thank you very much for your speech. It was very useful. My question is about the cybersecurity in supply chain. So lines hacking case. I thought that whether the cybersecurity in supply chain is really possible or not. So international laws, according to international law, I mean, what would be the direction of the international law to contribute to the cybersecurity in the supply chain? That is my first question. And second question, So GGE was formed back in 1998, as suggested by the Russia, and it's been over 10 years. However, it is not clear how to apply international laws to the cyberspace. What would be the critical challenge here in making further progress here? Those are my two questions. So anyone can answer to your questions? We have two questions. So I'd like to listen to any kind of answers from any volunteers here, if we have some proper answer. Dr. Anikanik, can you provide us some answers to these questions?
So on supply chain security, well, first I would point out that supply chain security is one of those questions where I would say the industry and the government have slightly different preferences on how to resolve it. So that, for example, we can expect industry pressure in the further international processes. But if you ask particularly like how to think about it in terms of international law, then in addition to these actual attacks that materialize via supply chain, and when there we ask whether a certain threshold, either use of force, prohibited intervention has been violated, there are also these more particular constructs in international law, such as, for example, the requirement of no technical harm in international telecommunications law. Or then there is this principle or like requirements of no attacks on certain infrastructure that we could apply here, so that those constructs could be revisited in the context of supply chain. And of course, much remains to be then done at national level. And this is how a lot of international law is implemented, that there is a basic guidance agreed by the countries, and then it gets implemented at national level with additional tasks on industry, for example. So it will not likely be guided directly at industry. And then on your second question, I believe it was about like how can we make progress on understanding better of how to apply international law to all this. I will offer short answers just in case I didn't get your full question. But the one thing is clear, that as long as we politically stay very fixated on two propositions, we need new international law, and then we absolutely don't want international law, we are not having a meaningful conversation. And that inevitably means that we are trying to wrap the existing international law against our preferred political position. And that, of course, affects the quality at which we make our arguments. Thank you.
So, yeah.
Okay, so in regard to supply chain, and each country has very diverse opinion. So in that regard, I would say that there are rooms for disputes and more dialogues. Then how would international law, which has been failure so far, then how would go in the future? And then also it is mentioned in the OEWG final report, the technology is developing very fast, and the technology itself is neutral, and then the malicious use of it is a problem. That was just the perspective of certain the states. And then there are also other states that the technology for good, they are endorsing the technology for good. So that AI regulation and then such can be somehow that adopted in the years to come, so that we are somehow in a not very non-conformed the stage at this moment. So that I would say it would take some time to have the concrete international law. And David Michael Madrish, do you have any ideas?
I would like to relate it to one of the points that Dr. Tick quite rightly identified and pointed out in her presentation about what we can characterize as something of a legal tautology around the threshold question of applicability. And while we do celebrate the achievement of noting IHL applicability in conflict, this doesn't change what we've already known, which is written black and white in the first articles of the Geneva Conventions, that it applies during armed conflict. So we've basically proven that water is wet. That's a cynical view, but when it comes to questions about a supply chain, I think we have to be careful how we apply the knowledge of that tautology and be careful not to see IHL where it does not apply, which is to say that not all actions, not all criminal actions, or not all interstate actions would apply the threshold of armed conflict. So looking at closer nuance as to what aspects of the supply chain we're talking about, is this the energy supply chain, are these vital infrastructures that are necessary for national security? These are issues that states are going to have to resolve through practice in the development of the norms, but the ICRC remains steadfast in its position that when attacks are made in an armed conflict through cyber means or through cyber operations or digital means, then yes, of course, the IHL still applies, and precautionary measures, which we've not discussed in detail, will have to be taken by those parties to the armed conflict. So if we take the example of, say, vital industrial infrastructure, including the digital infrastructure, and attacks upon a national security rising to the level of an armed conflict, then it does not necessarily mean that those attacks would be violations of IHL either. There's no shortcut around the threshold question.
고맙습니다. 시간이 3분 40초.
We have about 3 minutes left, so to keep the time. So we can spare less than 1 minute. Oh, so brothers, let's do, before we sum up, let's give about 1 minute to finish up. Dr. Bradis.
So one very short point to the question on supply chain security. I mean, this is not in a political vacuum. If you look at the original position that China, for example, submitted to both processes, so both the Open Net Working Group and the GGE, you see it's a very political take on supply chain security. It has everything to do with America trying to shut out Chinese industry from 5G and different kind of things. So it has everything to do with an ongoing tug of war between China and the United States, and they found a venue of supply chain security to use that. So it is not in a political isolation, and this impacts the way you will talk and can talk about these things also within these processes. So it's very good to talk about how the law applies, etc. But these processes are also profoundly political, and what happens in the political sphere, and it doesn't even necessarily has to be the digital political sphere, impacts these kind of processes.
Okay, 정 박사 마지막.
네.
The application of international laws to cyberspace, why we have failed to make progress. Of course, we have discussed it in GGE meetings as well. However, the participants in the meeting were not the experts in terms of the international laws. So we need to combine these different sectors to make further progress in this regard. And Mr. Majlis from ICRC.
I want to reiterate my thanks and congratulations for inviting us to this panel and for the continued good work. Thank you very much.
우리 국립외교원의 교수님.
예, 항상
I think everything has two sides, OEWG and GGE. Which one will be more effective? Regarding this topic, every country should be involved too. And then that such kind of active involvement will make a pressure on this topic, and then we can make a further progress. That can create the momentum. We have thematic groups, and then we need to. I mean, at the national level, of course, the Korean government should make further preparations, and each country should prepare for themselves, of course. And I'd like to hand over the mic to Annette. Miss Annette. Annette can take it.
For me, today's session, I'm really grateful to have been part of it, is a reminder of how important it is that we keep studying these processes, be they international processes, regional processes, national processes, because through these discussions, we get ourselves a better understanding of a meaningful equilibrium between international efforts, national efforts, private and public efforts, and actually also our own individual efforts to do a better job securing the digital environment. So the more we invest in this issue, the better we are able to be part of the solution. Thank you very much.
네, 우리 마지막으로 틱 박사께서
Lastly, Ms. Anna can take mention about international efforts and national efforts. I think I expect some intriguing, interesting results soon. Now, countries need to submit some national contribution regarding the international laws. Regarding the application of international laws to the cyberspace. So maybe next year around this time in Jeju, I think we may have a session again regarding the international laws and cyberspace. And that in that sense, we can make a further useful discussion based on the national cases. Once again, I'd like to extend my appreciation to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and experts from home and abroad, and interpreters, and then the preparation office of the Jeju Forum. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator and other presenters and discussants. Thank you very much.
Our DHO today. I'd like to thank all of you for your participants.
Thank you very much. This is the end of the whole session today. Please join us again tomorrow. Thank you.